What if the most famous character in European legends became more terrifying than any vampire? Forget about fangs and blood on lips. The real horrors unfolded just north of the Danube, in literal reality. There, where the fog ends and Wallachia begins, thundered not the fairy tale Dracula, but the real ruler, Vlad the Impaler, a man who invented a torture that even the Romans and Byzantines couldn't match. Why do we still remember Vlad the Impaler, a prince who participated in battles and intrigues of the 15th century, as history's nightmare? Enemies wrote about him, children were frightened with his name, and today his biography has spread across thousands of memes, comics, and pseudo-scientific analyses. But behind the image of a bloodthirsty monster lies not just cruelty for fear's sake, but a carefully calculated technology of terror. Can a person be cruel not only out of sadism, but from conscious political will? Before you will unfold one of the darkest pages of European history. You'll see how torture, something that seems like a blunt act of violence, transforms into a social instrument. You'll learn that historians call Vlad's most merciless method the mother's torture, when a woman was forced to watch the death of her own child. How does such a scenario emerge? And why was this more terrifying than the rod of gallows and the cold of iron torture? Why are these events truly important in an era of horror films, memes about Transylvania, and modern discussions about mass consciousness manipulation? Let's start with context. What kind of person was this, and what kind of time? Vlad III, who entered history as Vlad the Impaler or Dracula, was the ruler of Wallachia, a small but important principality between Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Transylvania. His reign fell in the middle of the 15th century, an era of great European turbulence. Literally every week could turn into war, palace conspiracy, or Ottoman attack. Europe was a bloody constructor set. Personal alliances, familial murders, crusades against infidels, and the threat of one's own country's disappearance. For Vlad, the struggle for power was daily practice, and the belief that cruelty maintains order was not shocking but normal. However, it was precisely his methods, especially impalement, as well as the agonizing choice for women, that made Vlad a symbol of absolute tyranny. We'll examine how his reputation formed, what myths and real facts were at hand for enemies and allies, how legends about him became viral 500 years before the internet appeared. There's evidence that Vlad could specifically choose witnesses to cruel executions. Some were from nobility, others were poor, still others were residents of controlled cities. Some sources claim that victims often didn't understand who and why should suffer before their eyes. This only intensified the atmosphere of terror. The main information about tortures comes from German and Slavic chronicles of the 15th century, treating Vlad's actions sometimes as disgusting deviation, sometimes as forced policy. Beginning to examine the darkest pages of Dracula's reign, it's important to remember, all descriptions of his numerous executions have been overgrown with exaggerations, authorial fears, and even political propaganda for centuries. But one detail from chronicles repeatedly knocks the ground from under your feet. The scene when a woman is obligated to watch the torture and death of her own child. Not just torture, but psychological apocalypse. We'll go through 5 key blocks. Detailed description of that very torture and its sources. Explain why terror often worked more effectively than armies. Separate myths from facts. Try to immerse ourselves in real human stories. And see that Vlad's fear was not spontaneous cruelty, but a mathematically precise mechanism for retaining power. Before you is not just an anatomy of horror. This is a story about those mechanisms of power that remain relevant even in the digital age. Are you ready to survive this experience and look into the eyes of real human evil? Or will you recognize modern allegories in the story? Imagine a world where every morning could be your last, not because of illness or old age, but because yesterday's ally decided to switch sides. The 15th century in Eastern Europe was exactly such a time. Wallachia, a small principality between the Danube and the Carpathians, was at the epicenter of geopolitical chaos. From the south, the Ottomans advanced. From the north, the Hungarians pressed. From the east, the Moldavians. And from within, the principality was torn apart by boyar conspiracies. Vlad III Dracula was born around 1431 in a family where betrayal was a professional skill. His father, Vlad II Dracula, got his nickname from the Order of the Dragon, a Christian military brotherhood created to fight Ottoman expansion. But when reality proved more complex than crusading ideals, Vlad Sr. began maneuvering between Christian Europe and the Muslim Porte. He gave his own sons, the future Impaler and his brother Radu, as hostages to the Sultan. 4 years in the Ottoman palace became a university of cruelty for young Vlad. What happens to a child who sees his father trading children for political benefits? How does the psyche of a person raised among janissaries, elite Ottoman troops famous for their discipline and ruthlessness, form? Turkish sources describe young Vlad as intelligent but uncontrollable captive who refused to accept Islam and constantly conflicted with his tutors. His brother Radu, on the contrary, adapted to Ottoman culture and later became the Sultan's ally against his own brother. When in 1447 Vlad Sr. and his eldest son were killed by rebelling boyars, 18-year-old the Impaler was left practically alone. The Ottomans freed him and helped capture the Wallachian throne. But this was an investment, not a gift. They expected loyalty, taxes, and military help. Vlad planned something completely different. His first reign lasted only 2 months. The Hungarians expelled him and put another pretender on the throne. Vlad spent the next 8 years in exile, watching his homeland turn into a battlefield between different factions. This time became a strategic pause for him. He studied management methods, military tactics, and most importantly, the psychology of fear. When in 1456 Vlad regained his throne, he was no longer an impulsive youth, but a calculating politician. Before him stood a task that seemed impossible: maintain the independence of a tiny principality between 3 great powers, having at his disposal an inexperienced army and treacherous nobility. Traditional methods, diplomacy, military alliances, dynastic marriages, worked poorly. Vlad chose terror, but his cruelty wasn't chaotic. Every execution, every torture had an addressee and purpose. When he impaled Ottoman envoys along with their turbans, he sent a signal to the Sultan. When he staged mass executions of boyars, he showed the nobility the price of betrayal. When he punished thieves and vagrants, he demonstrated to townspeople his determination to establish order. Historians estimate the number of Vlad's victims differently, from several thousand to 80,000 people. These figures include both prisoners of war and civilians. But he reserved the most cruel methods for special occasions. The stake was his calling card, but far from his only instrument. Burning alive, skinning, hammering nails into heads. All this was practiced before Vlad. His innovation was the systematization of horror. A special place in the Impaler's arsenal was occupied by tortures directed not only at the victim, but also at witnesses. Forcing parents to watch children suffering, wives to watch husbands torment, children to watch parents' execution. This wasn't just cruelty, but technology for affecting collective psyche. One case of such execution could terrorize an entire city for months ahead. Modern studies of terror psychology confirm the effectiveness of such methods. When a person sees a loved one suffering, their psyche receives double trauma, from their own helplessness and from empathetic pain. Vlad intuitively understood these mechanisms centuries before the appearance of scientific psychology. European courts followed events in Wallachia with horror. German chronicles of that time are filled with descriptions of the Wallachian prince's devilish acts. But the paradox is that many of Vlad's contemporaries, including some church figures, supported his methods. In an era when Christian Europe was under threat of Ottoman expansion, a cruel but effective ally seemed the lesser evil. There exists a boundary that the human psyche isn't ready to cross even under threat of death. For most people, this line runs through their own children's suffering. Vlad the Impaler didn't just cross this boundary. He turned it into a weapon of mass destruction. Among all his sophisticated intimidation methods, the most devastating was the torture that German chronicles call the mother's choice. A woman was placed before a dilemma: watch her child's agonizing death or die herself, leaving the child to fate. The first detailed description of this practice appears in the story of the Wallachian voivode Dracula, written around 1480 by an unknown German author. According to the chronicle, Vlad practiced this torture on women from boyar families he suspected of treason. The procedure was theatrical and public. It was conducted in the square before the castle so that the maximum number of witnesses could see what was happening. What did this execution look like in practice? A woman was brought to the square and told the conditions. If she refused to watch her child's execution, she would be killed immediately, but the child would die anyway. If she agreed to become a witness, The child would be executed before her eyes, but her life would be spared. No third option existed. This wasn't a choice between life and death, but a choice between different forms of psychological destruction. The Byzantine historian Chalco Kondyles, Vlad's contemporary, adds another horrifying detail. Mothers weren't just offered to observe, but were required to participate in preparations for execution. They had to tie up the child with their own hands or bring water for the executioner. This detail turned the torture into a ritual of complicity, destroying the victim's last psychological defenses. Why did Vlad choose precisely this method? Analysis of his political actions shows that every public execution had a specific purpose. The mother's torture was directed against boyar families, the traditional support of aristocratic opposition. In medieval Wallachia, women from noble families played an important role in political intrigues. They arranged marriages, passed secret information, influenced decisions of husbands and sons. By destroying the psyche of boyar wives and mothers, Vlad deprived opponents of an important resource. Moldavian chronicles preserved a story about a specific case of applying this torture. In the spring of 1459, Vlad accused Boyar Aldenik of correspondence with Hungarians. There was no proof of treason, but the prince decided to stage a demonstrative execution. Aldenik's wife, Anna, was brought to the square together with her 11-year-old son. The woman begged to be executed instead of the child, but Vlad was inflexible. Either she would become a witness to her son's death, or they would both die. What happened in the psyche of a woman who found herself in such a situation? Modern traumatology describes such states as moral trauma, damage to a person's value system when they're forced to act against their own beliefs. A mother watching her child's murder experienced not just grief, but complete destruction of her own identity. She continued to exist physically, but died psychologically. Hungarian sources claim that Vlad specifically selected women with children of a certain age for such execution, from 7 to 14 years old. Children younger than 7 didn't understand what was happening, and teenagers older than 14 could psychologically resist. The optimal age ensured maximum suffering for both child and mother. Were there cases when women refused the choice? Polish chronicler Jan Długosz mentions boyar woman Maria, who spat in Vlad's face and demanded to be executed instead of her son. The prince ordered the child killed first, then the mother. But such examples of resistance were rare. Most women broke under pressure and agreed to the executioner's conditions. Technical details of the execution were also thought out to the smallest detail. Children usually weren't impaled. This death was too quick for torture purposes. They were often burned on slow fire or torn apart by horses. The duration of agony was calculated so that the mother would have time to experience all stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression. Acceptance never came. What psychological effect did this torture have on witnesses? German sources report that after such executions, a special silence fell over cities. People were afraid to speak even at home, fearing they might be overheard. Women stopped having children, understanding that motherhood could become a weapon against them. Some families left Wallachia, preferring poverty in foreign lands to life under the Impaler's rule. Vlad understood that such torture worked not only against the specific victim, but also as a preventive measure. It was enough to conduct several such executions to intimidate the entire aristocracy. Boyar wives became hostages to their husband's loyalty. Any hint of opposition could turn into a nightmare for their children. Modern neuroscience explains why this torture was particularly effective. Watching loved ones suffer activates the same brain areas as one's own pain. But in the case of mother and child, this effect is amplified many times due to biological attachment mechanisms. The woman literally experienced death twice, as a witness and as a mother. What do a medieval prince impaling people and a modern dictator broadcasting executions on television have in common? Both understand a fundamental principle. One act of public violence can replace 1,000 soldiers. Vlad the Impaler intuitively discovered what 21st century psychologists call the availability effect, when vivid, emotionally charged events seem more probable than they actually are. One cruel execution, seen personally or retold by witnesses, created in people's minds the illusion that similar fate could befall anyone at any moment. Analysis of Vlad's actions shows that his terror wasn't chaotic. He followed certain principles that are studied today in political psychology courses. The first principle was unpredictability. Execution victims were chosen not only by guilt criteria, but also to demonstrate that no one was safe. A rich boyar could end up on a stake next to a poor thief. This deprived people of the ability to calculate risks and led to constant stress. The second principle was escalation. Each new execution had to surpass the previous one in cruelty or inventiveness. If yesterday Vlad impaled ordinary criminals, today he could force a priest to eat consecrated meat with human blood, and tomorrow arrange a mother's choice for his ally's wife. This logic didn't allow society to adapt to the level of violence. The third principle was ritualization. Executions weren't conducted spontaneously, but as carefully staged spectacles. They had fixed time, place, sequence of actions. Vlad understood that predictability of form with unpredictability of content strengthened psychological impact. People knew that every Saturday something terrible might happen on the square, but didn't know what exactly. How does mass fear psychology work? Modern research shows that collective horror spreads according to the same laws as epidemics. One person who witnessed a cruel execution tells dozens of acquaintances about it. They pass the story further, each time adding new details. After several weeks, the entire region knows about an event that at most 100 people saw personally. Vlad masterfully used these mechanisms. He specifically left alive several witnesses of each major execution and released them to neighboring cities and countries. These people became unwilling spreaders of his reputation. Hungarian and Polish chronicles are full of stories from Wallachian refugees, each of whom brought new terrifying details. But the most sophisticated element of Vlad's system was its selectivity. He didn't arrange total terror against the entire population. This would have led to uprising or mass exodus. Instead, he created categories of people in the high-risk zone: traitors, thieves, foreigners, those too rich or too poor. Ordinary peasants and craftsmen, who made up the majority of the population, could feel relatively safe if they didn't violate established rules. This strategy created an atmosphere of wary loyalty in society. People didn't just fear Vlad, they became accomplices in his system. Neighbors informed on each other, afraid of being accused of harboring criminals. Servants watched masters, children watched parents. Society turned into a network of mutual control. Comparison with modern dictatorships shows striking similarity of methods. Stalin's repressions of the 30s, the Cultural Revolution in China, the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia, all these systems used principles that Vlad applied 500 years earlier. Unpredictability of repressions, publicity of punishments, turning citizens into informers, creating categories of enemies of the people. Even in democratic societies, elements of this logic appear in moments of crisis. Witch hunts in 17th century America, McCarthyism of the 50s, modern fight against terrorism. Everywhere you can find echoes of Vlad's methods. Of course, the scales and forms of violence differ dramatically, but psychological mechanisms remain the same. Of special interest is Vlad's use of family ties as an instrument of control. Threatening relatives, especially children, proved to be a universal method of coercion. Modern terrorist organizations, mafia structures, totalitarian regimes regularly use this technique. A person might be ready for their own death, but rarely able to sacrifice loved ones. The digital age has added new dimensions to old methods. Public humiliation on social networks, cyberbullying, doxing, all these are modern versions of Vlad's principle of punishment publicity. The internet allows making reputation execution visible to millions of witnesses, and the effect it lasts for years thanks to digital memory. The economics of fear has also evolved. If Vlad spent resources organizing executions, modern control systems profit from selling fears. Media corporations earn from alarming news, politicians from promises of protection from imaginary threats, security corporations from selling means against risks they themselves inflate. Vlad the Impaler was a pioneer of what today is called politics of fear. His methods seem archaic only externally. The essence remains relevant. Whoever controls society's collective fears controls society itself. The difference is only in instruments. Instead of stakes, screens are used. Instead of squares, social networks. Instead of executioners, algorithms. Many stories about Vlad the Impaler have survived to our days, and most of them are filled with such wild details that they seem like fiction. 15th century Europeans called him Vlad Dracula, putting into this nickname the meaning not just of barbarism, but of genuine obsession with evil. On the pages of German and Hungarian chronicles, facts and rumors, fears and speculation coexist. It's important to understand which of these stories are based on real events and where did the fantasy of political opponents work. The first and most persistent myth is Vlad's mental inadequacy. Stories that he drank the blood of the executed, held feasts among corpses, chose victims for pleasure, became fixed in popular consciousness thanks to German pamphlets of the 16th century. But historians note that neither Byzantine nor Moldavian chroniclers nor official Ottoman chroniclers confirm these episodes. In most cases, not excesses of sadism are remembered, but stern calculation. According to researcher Radu Florescu, attempts to present Vlad as insane were part of information warfare. The more terrible the prince looked in military confrontation, the more decisively Christians united. The second misconception relates to the scale of his cruelty. The figures, 40,000 executed, 60,000 tortured, are taken from chronicles written decades after Vlad's death. More realistic estimates from Romanian and Hungarian sources speak of numbers from 5,000 to 15,000 people over his entire reign. Terrible, but within the usual practices of repressions of the era. For comparison, Grand Inquisitor Torquemada executed from 2,000 to 8,000 people over 2 decades. Many European monarchs staged mass bloodshed, but their names aren't remembered like Dracula's name. The third myth concerns the origin of his methods. In popular culture, Vlad is perceived as a natural talent of cruelty, as if all his tortures were personal discoveries. However, analysis of sources shows the opposite. Many execution methods were known in the Ottoman Empire, Hungary, and Rus. The stake as the main symbol of terror came from Turkish practices, and Vlad borrowed the technology of intimidation and publicity from European neighbors. The only truly original technique is considered the mother's choice. In the fourth myth, Vlad is presented as a monster, hating everyone indiscriminately, but official documents of Wallachia tell of several acts of justice. He encouraged well-behaved townspeople, developed trade, protected ulans and cattle herders from robbery. His cruelty manifested primarily as a response to conspiracies, treason, threats of foreign intervention. Romanian chroniclers testify that simple peasants perceived Vlad more as a hero than as a villain. His real anger fell upon nobility, corrupt officials, and interventionists. In the fifth widespread misconception that all Europeans considered Vlad an enemy. In reality, until the end of his life, he enjoyed support from several Polish and Romanian princes, received titles and military help from Hungarian King Matthias, and some German cities even invited Vlad as a military consultant. Fear and respect for Vlad existed simultaneously. Precisely this double feeling became the foundation of his legend. What do modern historians say? Brian Whitley, author of the critical analysis Vlad the Impaler, Between Myth and Document, emphasizes, for a complete picture, it's important to consider not only descriptions of executions, but also the context of the era. 15th century Europe lived in times of almost continuous wars, famine, epidemics, and betrayals. Cruelty was not an exception, but part of the political instrument. The fact that Vlad perfected this instrument doesn't turn him into an irrational maniac. He was a strategist of fear. He used mechanisms of horror as a form of social management, worked with reputation modes like modern marketers manage brand image. Let's turn to motives. Why did precisely the mother's torture become a symbol of absolute cruelty? The answer lies in properties of human psyche. People endure the death of loved ones harder than their own. Vlad aimed not just at the body, but at society's soul. Hostile boyar public gave birth to potential avengers, wives and mothers who knew how to unite clans, inspire revenge. By cutting the most important link, maternal empathy and family support, Vlad destroyed the opposition structure precisely where it was most solid. What sources confirm these interpretations? The most authoritative are Moldavian chronicles, Byzantine notes by Chalka Condyles, the German chronicle Tragedy of Dracula, and Wallachian court protocols. Modern historical science indicates where exaggerations are and where truthful details are. Real witnesses of executions were in the minority, which cannot be said about storytellers and chroniclers who exaggerated for political effect enhancement. The several times changing image of Vlad in history, from torturer to folk hero, demonstrates how easily horrors turn into propaganda instruments. Contemporaries saw in him both savior and nightmare, strategy and madness. This contradiction emphasizes something important. Real power is rarely built on fear alone. It's more complex and always requires precise fact analysis. History becomes understandable only when living human faces emerge from behind numbers and dates. Among 15th century documents, eyewitness testimonies have survived that allow recreating the atmosphere of those days and understanding how Vlad's terror affected specific people. These stories aren't fiction, but documentary records made by contemporaries of events. The first story came to us thanks to notes by Hungarian merchant Michael from Brasov, who conducted trade business in Wallachia in the spring of 1458. In his diary, he describes a case with the family of local boyar Stanku, suspected of connections with Turks. The boyar's wife, Elena, was brought to the square together with her 9-year-old son, Mircea. Vlad personally announced the conditions to her. If she refused to watch the child's execution, they would kill both immediately. If she agreed, the son would die, but she would remain alive. Michael recorded that the woman stood silently for several minutes, then fell to her knees and began begging for mercy. Vlad was inflexible. When Elena understood there was no choice, she asked permission to hug her son one last time. The prince allowed it. According to the merchant's testimony, the boy didn't understand what was happening and asked his mother why she was crying. Elena told him they would soon meet in heaven and told him not to be afraid. The execution lasted about an hour. The child wasn't impaled. Vlad chose a slower death. The boy was tied to a post, and a small fire was lit under him, which was gradually made stronger. The mother stood 10 steps away, surrounded by guards who wouldn't let her turn away. Michael notes that Elena didn't scream or struggle. She seemed to turn to stone. Only when everything was over did she collapse unconscious. What happened to this woman afterward? The Hungarian merchant met her 6 months later at the market. Elena was alive, but looked like a ghost, thin, gray-haired, with an empty gaze. She was selling some rags and didn't recognize acquaintances. According to neighbors, the woman spoke only to her dead son, whom she saw everywhere. A year later, she was found dead at home. The cause of death was unknown, but the doctor said her heart simply stopped. The second story is recorded in the Chronicle of Moldavian monk Anthony. In the winter of 1459, a detachment of Hungarian envoys arrived at Wallachia's borders with a peace proposal. Vlad received them solemnly, but on the last day of negotiations, ordered the arrest of the chief envoy, Ladislaus Corvinus, nephew of the Hungarian king. The accusation was standard: espionage and conspiracy preparation. Ladislaus was married to a Moldavian boyar's daughter, and they had a 3-year-old daughter. Vlad ordered the wife and child brought from Moldavia. When they arrived, the prince announced he would execute the entire family, but would give the wife a choice. She could watch her husband and daughter die and remain alive, or die first without seeing their suffering. Anna, the envoy's wife's name, chose death. She told Vlad she couldn't live knowing about her loved one's torment and asked to be killed quickly. The prince agreed. The woman was beheaded with one sword blow. But he didn't keep his promise. He executed the husband and daughter the next day, though there was no one to watch. Monk Anthony explains this act thus: Vlad wanted to show that even the right choice didn't guarantee mercy. This story had political consequences. Hungarian King Matthias used his nephew's murder as pretext for breaking the alliance with Vlad. 2 years later, Hungarian troops invaded Wallachia and expelled the Impaler. Thus, one cruel execution cost Vlad his throne, but he apparently believed that demonstrating strength was more important than diplomatic considerations. The third story, the most detailed, is contained in notes by German priest Johann Funke, who served in Saxon communities of Transylvania. In the autumn of 1460, a group of German craftsmen was accused of tax evasion and smuggling. Among them was blacksmith's widow Catherine with 2 sons, 14 and 16 years old. Vlad offered Catherine a special choice. She could choose which son to execute first and which to leave alive. The woman refused to choose and asked to be executed herself. Then the prince changed conditions. If she chose, one son would remain alive and gain freedom. If she refused, all 3 would die. Catherine still wouldn't agree. Then Vlad turned to the youths themselves and suggested they choose who would die and who would remain with their mother. The older son, Hans, said he was ready to die for his brother. The younger, Michel, on the contrary, declared that the older was more needed by the family. Vlad listened to them and ordered both executed, saying that those who easily give their lives don't deserve them. Catherine went mad before witnesses' eyes. She began screaming that her sons were alive and demanded their release. Funke writes that the woman lived another 7 years, but never returned to reality. The local German community supported her until death, considering her a martyr. These stories are united by one detail. In all cases, Vlad didn't just kill, but destroyed the system of human connections. He forced people to betray their own feelings, broke family bonds, turned love into a source of suffering. The goal wasn't physical destruction of opponents, but moral decomposition of society. Modern psychologists call such methods systemic violence, when aggression is directed not at an individual person, but at their social connections. Vlad intuitively understood that people suffer more from losing loved ones than from their own pain. By destroying families before society's eyes, he undermined the foundations of human solidarity. When we look back at Vlad the Impaler's era, we face not only the question of the cause of his cruelty, but also the problem of power's nature under conditions of constant threat. In the 15th century, the country was on the brink of disappearance. Ottomans advance, nobility betrays every week, borders tremble from conspiracies and intrigues. In such circumstances, terror transforms from individual madness into a systemic instrument of governance, devoid of moral doubts. Deep analysis of Vlad's repressions shows, behind the facade of horror lies politics. His executions were always targeted, directed against the most dangerous or doubtful elements capable of organizing conspiracy or changing the balance of power. Family tortures, including rituals of mothers observing children's deaths, served specific purposes. Break fighting spirit, show helplessness of even the most supportive part of society, crush ideas of blood revenge. Not only the direct object of violence suffered, but also everyone who observed, heard, then told others. The prince staged demonstrative acts so rumors would spread and fear would multiply. This is how informational terror mechanisms work. History showed that such policy could be short-term effective. Vlad held power for more than 10 years, repelled several Turkish offensives, broke Boyar's positions in his principality. However, systemic terror destroyed social connections, generated immigration, exhausted the economy, eroded trust between people. Even victories turned into long-term costs. After series of the harshest executions, as Moldavian and Saxon chronicles show, fewer children were born in the region for years. The level of trade deals fell. The influx of craftsmen decreased. This structure of terror became a peculiar prototype of future dictatorships in European and world history, from the French Revolution to totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. Perhaps the main difference between cruelty for cruelty's sake and cruelty as a system lies in scale and understanding of its consequences. If solitary sadism flares up and dies out, strategic terror lives for decades and leaves behind not just fear, but broken destinies, deficit of solidarity, and cultures infected with myths. What should the reader take from this story? First of all, cruelty as a language of power not only destroys enemies, but also gives birth to new forms of resistance, in secret communities, legend retellings, in the growth of distrust toward any structures. Vlad the Impaler showed, if terror mechanisms become the norm, then society loses the foundation of trust, and any change threatens an outbreak of revenge, chaos, or flight. Today, when the world is full of new forms of psychological violence, digital bullying, political repressions, reputation executions, lessons from the past become even more relevant. One practical recommendation that can be drawn by the reader is to remember that fear works only where there's no culture of mutual aid. A strong society resists terrors not with cruelty, but with solidarity and honest dialogue. A question for reflection. Are modern systems capable of preventing the appearance of new Vlads, when instead of stakes there are algorithms, and instead of squares there are media? Is it worth justifying terror with the struggle for survival, if its consequences destroy the very possibility of the future? We examine Dracula's legend not for horror's sake, but for understanding mechanisms that have worked in human society for hundreds of years. Your story doesn't have to repeat others' mistakes. Fear's main role should remain in horror films, not in your relationships with the world.